So, China. Everyone's talking about China, lots of different opinions, many of them very strong.
We're building China. We are really building China because everything we make is made in China or other countries. It's not made here. We don't make things anymore.
When Americans go shopping, they walk into a department store, just look at the labels. Look at where the products are manufactured. And time after time after time, where the products come from is China, China, and China.
What we envy in China today, maybe unrealistically, is not their Maoism, it's their Reaganism. What we envy is not their communism, but their capitalism.
Where are the hotspots?
Well, basically China. China has to be the next one with the big crash.
And for people who sit around saying, oh, there'll be a China crash, I think this is just wishful non-thinking.
The reason some of us worry about China is we depend on you to buy our debt.
We see the Chinese as 10 feet tall, that they own us. They don't. They have to buy U.S. Treasury obligations because their economy is so dependent on the U.S. market. They have no choice.
The trade agreement with China was an unmitigated disaster for American workers.
People say, oh, you don't like China. No, I love them. But their leaders are much smarter than our leaders.
China, 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 China.
I like China.
I am speechless. I've got nothing. Okay, let's start with some basics. Now, the Chinese economy has been growing rapidly for like the last 30 years. And depending on how you measure these things, China today is either the world's largest or the world's second largest economy. And if it's the second largest, it's gonna be largest soon, so just get used to that, okay? Now, despite all of that, China today remains a decidedly middle-income country. There are plenty of rich Chinese people, but China overall is not a rich and wealthy country. Everyone knows that we in America import a lot of Chinese consumer products, like way more than we export. So in 2015, for example, our trade deficit with China was about $365 billion. That's $1 billion for every day of the year. And that was, by a considerable margin, our largest trade deficit with any country. Like number 2 was Germany, and that was about $74 billion. So China is way up there in a class of its own. We did run trade surpluses as well with a lot of other countries. Like I'm looking at you, Brazil. You add it all up together and you get an overall 2015 trade deficit for the United States of maybe $530 billion. That is a lot of money. But for a country with a GDP of about 18 trillion, it's not huge. Now, if you import more than you export, you've got to pay for all of that extra somehow. And here in the United States, we pay for it by borrowing money. And that brings us to the subject of debt. So another thing that everybody knows is that the Chinese government holds a lot of U.S. debt. Now, there are all different ways of measuring this, like no surprise, right? But in January 2016, the U.S. government's total public debt was about $13.5 trillion. That is all of the money that the U.S. government owed to anybody who was not the U.S. government. It doesn't take into account about like $5 trillion that the U.S. government basically owes to itself, which, not gonna lie, that's kind of weird. 13.5 trillion, that is a huge, huge amount of money. But as a percentage of America's gross domestic product, it is actually not out of line with other wealthy and developed countries' national debts. Now, by the way, this chart was put together by the government of Canada to show off how awesome they are and how little public debt they have, and that's why Canada is in blue. Way to go, Canada. So, of that $13.5 trillion, A little more than 50% is held by the American public, so like companies, mutual funds, private citizens. Another 1.3 trillion is held by the Chinese government, and then another 1.3 trillion is held by the Japanese government. Okay, so the big question that everybody seems to want to ask is, who's winning and who's losing? Is this a good thing or a bad thing or what? Now, obviously, I'm not going to answer that question. That's your responsibility. But I am going to suggest that before you try to answer it, you consider a couple of things. First, if this is a game, then who are the players, really? Is this a game between countries, the United States and China? Or is it a game between companies like Apple and Foxconn? Or is it a game between individuals like this factory worker in Flint, Michigan, and that labor contractor in Shanghai? How you answer that question is actually really significant. Like, a particular outcome might be good for one group of Americans, but bad for the United States as a whole. A different outcome might be great for China overall, but terrible for a Chinese company like Lenovo. So you really have to think about who the actors are here, who the players are. Second, if this is a game, what kind of game is it? Like, a lot of people talk as if U.S.-China relations are a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, one side's gain is the other side's loss. If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. Think of basically any team sport here. Like, it's impossible for both sides to win the Super Bowl. At least, I assume it is. I don't really follow sports. Is our relationship with China like that? Either we win or they win. Or are U.S.-China relations more like a positive-sum game? Positive-sum games are not necessarily win-lose. There are possible outcomes that can benefit both sides. So, in theory, just about any business deal should be positive-sum. Like, I'm not going to buy what you're selling unless I value it more highly than the money that I'm spending. And you're not going to sell it to me unless you value the money you're receiving more highly than the thing you're selling. So we both win. It's positive sum. So what kind of a game are we playing with China? Now, I already suggested that trade is generally positive sum, because like if it weren't, both parties wouldn't agree to it in the first place. However, that's not the whole story. Several of you have already noticed that economics and politics are just inseparable. And a lot of very smart people will tell you that power politics is just inescapably zero sum. One country's gain is every other country's loss. If China gets richer, then China becomes more powerful, and as a result, America's relative power in the world decreases. Is that how U.S.-China relations are? Like, which is it? How should we think about China's expanding role in the global economy? That is your problem.